Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to former MI5 officer and whistleblower Annie Méchant, now of LEAP, the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Annie, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
All right, Annie, you say there's a third front opened in the global war. There's the war on drugs, the war on terror, and now we have the war on the internet. Elaborate, and who benefits from this?
Well, I think the military-industrial complex benefits the most. I mean, this is something that President Eisenhower talked about 50 years ago. But I would now reclassify it as the military-security complex, because security is big business, and surveillance is big business across the planet. It's a sort of race between the governments and the corporate elites to try and crack down on our freedoms, and they use those three wars to do that as justification. So you have the war on terror, of course, that's brought about the Patriot Act, and it's shredded our civil liberties in the UK. The war on drugs has been used for the last 40, 50 years for exactly the same purposes globally, and has caused interventions across the planet on the part of the US. And now we have the major corporations, the major entertainment corporations, trying to crack down on the internet, which of course is vital to the free flow of all our information, the free flow of our speech as well.
Right, so just to unpack this phrase military-industrial complex a little bit, because people have used it now so much, it's become, I think it's lost some of its meaning, but when you say military, you're talking about the government, and when you're talking about industrial, you're talking about corporations. So you're talking about fascism.
Exactly. I mean,
fascism. America is suffering from fascism.
Yeah.
They've got the Pentagon will go on Jon Stewart's show, you know, in the second half, and they'll push war. Yeah. And so he totally condones this industrial military complex in America, and that's considered the alternative media. So they love it. The Fox News promotes it. The military, the Pentagon goes on Fox News. They engage America in wars, and people die, and they celebrate that because they're fascist. You know, fill in the epithet from there. All right, so you've got the internet, which is becoming, going the way of the war on terror, war on drugs, and of course the war on drugs, we've got beheadings in Mexico. So at what point does an Aaron Swartz, instead of just threatening to put him into a gulag, does a government, the fascist in Washington, just decapitate him? When's that coming? Soon?
Well, certainly we're seeing a reclassification of internet activists, as well as activists in the real world, as domestic extremists and, in fact, terrorists. So, for example, Occupy on the streets of London, they were warning the police in the City of London that they could potentially be a terrorist group. So activists are now being classified in that way. Activists are now being persecuted and watched and infiltrated in exactly the same way as terrorist groups or drug cartels. And I think we are sliding very rapidly to a point where the state will start incarcerating and deeming them to be terrorists. And of course, once you're deemed to be a terrorist, you're outside the due process. Anything can happen to you. You can be extraordinarily rendered, kidnapped, thrown into a secret prison, even tortured. That's what's going on.
This is all being normalized.
Yes.
So the beheading of internet activists will come just as chopping off the heads of folks in Mexico. I would imagine Martha Stewart would have a show, How to Decorate Your Home, with the decapitated heads of your family members that have been fascistically assassinated extrajudicially because they threatened the next Hollywood blockbuster. You know, so Martha, that's a good idea for a show. Heads on pike, what color?
Well, of course, what we should be doing is decapitating some of the banksters who are, you know, ruining our planet.
They'll be doing collateralized debt obligations based on the decapitated heads on spikes designed by Martha Stewart, brought to you by Lloyd Blankfein. He'll be making, of course, oodles and oodles of money on this, as he always does. Now, you were a whistleblower for MI5, and part of the whistleblowing was about domestic surveillance. Much of the population today feels that they have nothing to hide. So what do you think about that response?
It's not about having something to hide, it's about having a right to privacy. Why should the government have access to every aspect of your information, your personal lives? And yet we're sort of offering it up now. We've been groomed by ghastly TV shows like Big Brother, where if you win that, you get onto a C-list celeb lifestyle. Or, for example, Facebook, where, again, you're expected, you're encouraged to offer up all your personal information. So Facebook, for example, is doing precisely what the spy's wet dream, gathering the sort of information that we would have been gathering on subversives or domestic extremists. And it's not just the official spies we have to worry about these days. We have the undercover cops, and we also have this explosion of mercenary spy companies, which are sent into the Middle East for security muscle, but also are infiltrating all the activist groups around the planet, including the internet activist groups. Who can you trust? I mean, there was a case with Lulsec, one of the hacker groups, Sabu, was one of the leading hackers in that group, and he was caught and turned by the FBI. So who can you trust? It becomes very corrosive to a cohesive sense of society when you have to look over your shoulder because someone might be reporting on you. It's like living under the Stasi in East Germany.
Right, I don't know if you saw the story a couple of weeks ago about scientists had hacked into the brain of a cockroach and connected it to Twitter.
Was he in the Senate in the US by any chance?
This was an insect, and they had hacked into the cockroach's brain, and it was being controlled by Twitter. So the Twitter tweets that were coming in through Twitter were having an effect on the cockroach and steering him. So when I think about Americans who are hooked up to these social networking sites being surveyed on by the fascists in Washington, it's not about that they need to protect themselves, their privacy, so much as they're being steered like cockroaches into the consumer end of society, into the debt end, because without the debt and without these cockroach Americans being steered by the Pentagon into being over-indebted, the economy would collapse overnight.
Well, don't forget they've got the military as well to buff up the economy. I mean, it's big business
well, they
now in
threaten
prisons.
you. They say either go into debt and be a consumer whore, or we'll assassinate you extrajudicially. But it'll look great because Martha Stewart will do the fabulous color job on your assassination.
Have you heard about Face Deal? This is some spin-off from Facebook, where if you are a loyal customer to certain places, they will use facial recognition technology in the restaurant you go to or the shop you go to, feed it back to Face Deal, and then you'll get little updates on Facebook saying, oh, well, you know, you can get a special discount next time you visit. So, in fact, we're being bribed to allow corporations to spy on us.
Right. Americans will give up their liberties for $5 off a pizza.
Yeah.
That's unfortunately the state of America today. Now, speaking of privacy, Kim.com in New Zealand is relaunching his mega site, the uploading of material. And, you know, he was extrajudicially targeted by MPAA, Chris Dodd. I'm sure if he could have just assassinated him on the spot, he would have, but he's in New Zealand, so Chris had to hire some mercenaries to go get him. But he's relaunched Mega, and he says it's all about privacy. And, of course, this is potentially a game changer for Hollywood because they've done an end run around what many consider to be completely unconscionable copyright laws that destroy the creative industries. Do you think this will have a chance? Do you see it? I don't know if you looked at Mega too. What are your thoughts?
No, I think it's a very good initiative. And it won't destroy the creative industry because what he's offering is that artists can upload their stuff to his sites and they will get 90% of the revenue generated by that. It will destroy the middlemen. The pimps, the people who control the publication of books or the creation of music or the creation of films. And it's that industry that is getting heavy in trying to back down on internet freedoms because their business models bust.
That's a good point to make, is that the artists are going to be getting more of the cash. The distributors in Hollywood, Universal Studios, Steven Spielberg's company, Lionsgate, these other distributors who are just taking money and they're lobbying through Washington in a way that subverts the whole idea of the creative industry by lobbying for perpetual copyright. They're the copyright whores in effect. They're doing the damage. Chris Dodd and the MPAA are extrajudicially assassinating the copyright as it was iterated by Jefferson in the Constitution, Article 17 originally.
Absolutely.
So this could be a burst of creativity by getting around the copyright gatekeepers that are destroying, and of course to make up for the revenues they end up producing films that are pornography and violence. I mean, that's the Lionsgate bread and butters, just violence and pornography.
But the other issue about this is, of course, if you allow the media corporations to build an architecture on the internet so they can spy to see if anyone's infringing copyright, then the architecture is there for the spies and the governments to survey us as well. You can't allow the media corporations to look at us without allowing those powers to be abused by other segments of government. So it's a very dangerous path to go down. It's almost like the copyright industry is being used as a stalking horse by our governments, by the elites, in order to erode still further our privacies. And it does subvert the whole democratic process. I mean, look what happened with ACTA, anti-copyright trade agreement in Europe, where the European Parliament, even the parliamentarians, weren't allowed to see the terms of that trade agreement. It was signed quietly, and it was going to be imposed quietly until, of course, a bunch of hacktivists got involved and spread the word, and there were demonstrations across Europe, and it was kicked out. So we've got to get active.
Aaron Swartz's father says the government killed his son. What are your thoughts?
I think they bear a diabolical responsibility. This is a man who was turned his back on corporate life, wasn't interested in making money, was very interested in internet freedom, and walked the walk. And for doing that, for just trying to copy some files which he had an absolute right to access anyway, he was hounded and faced 35 years in prison, in a maximum security prison, for doing that, for trying to liberate information for the good of humanity. Now, I can't think of anything more grotesque than that.
Is there an end game to this? In other words, if the corporations in Hollywood are going to push the public only so far before you have an American Spring type moment and they seek regime change, as is dictated in the Constitution. That's every American's responsibility to overthrow their government if the tyranny takes over. Are we at that moment yet, do you think? Or the Americans are just too drugged up and obese?
I think we're getting very close to that moment, and it'll probably tip when the American economy, when people recognize the American economy is bankrupt. I mean, it is already, but most people don't want to accept that. So as things get harder, as prices go up because of food shortages, as energy goes up, I think that scarcity will tip the population into that moment. But I also think there's a sort of arms race between the corporatists to crack down and take away all our freedoms and to make sure it's endemic surveillance society before that point is reached. So that when the people do take to the streets and try and string the banksters up on the lanterns, it's too late because every movement can be followed. It's like some sort of dystopian future that even George Orwell couldn't have foreseen.
Right. You know, it's funny that in America, the Federal Reserve will say, well, we're fighting deflation. Meanwhile, at J.P. Morgan and Blythe Masters here in London, they're cornering all the commodity markets, agricultural markets, the silver markets, the precious metal markets, because they know that the economy in America, in the UK, is essentially bankrupt, and that hyperinflation is 100% guaranteed, and they want to be positioned to be controlling, as you make the transition from the paper markets of the post-Reagan Thatcher deregulatory environment to the new commodity-based economy, the new gold-based currencies that will take over for the dollar and these other fiat currencies. But for some reason, people in America, they see that their prices are going up, their standard of livings are crashing, but they buy this idea that the Fed's fighting deflation. Is it just financial illiteracy, or do they instinctively know that the fact that they haven't been destroyed yet is due to the cheap prices that come their way, relatively speaking, to people in Cairo or Athens because of the fascists in Washington and the Pentagon?
I think more and more people are beginning to understand that. But I think we are going to reach a tipping point where there is so much scarcity that people will have to do something about it. It's going to become bleeding obvious. We've had it so easy for so long since the Second World War, at least in the West. We've had no scarcity. We've had a rising standard of living, and that's, of course, all reversing now. And there will be a change, a big change afoot, I think, in the coming years.
All right, Annie Méchant, we're out of time. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank my guest, Annie Méchant of Leap. If you'd like to contact us, please tweet us at Keiser Report or at facebook.com/Keiser Report. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.